Good day, chess world. So we are continuing our exploration and journey of the wonderful book series Logical Chess, Move by Move. And we today step into game 20, which was played by Rubinstein. Now, Akiba Rubinstein is a fascinating chess player from the turn of the 1900s. Between the years 1908 and 1912, Rubinstein was definitely the sole challenger to Lasker as to who was the world's best player. And oftentimes with his performances was regarded as the world number one. He unfortunately never had the chance to challenge Lasker in a world championship match. And his best year was 1912, where he won 5 consecutive super tournaments, something that wasn't repeated until modern times. And Rubinstein had a great influence on the modern game. You will see when we go through this game, his game almost looks like it was played by masters yesterday. It's a wonderful demonstration of positional understanding, recognizing weaknesses in the opponent's camp and how to exploit them. And that's what this series of games that we're focusing on is all about weaknesses and identifying them and how to exploit them. Here we're going to see in this one how Rubinstein fixes dark squared weaknesses on black's queen side, creates holes, and then exploits those holes, fixes the weak pawns, and wins those pawns to win a very convincing game. So this game kicks off with the queen's pawn game. Then we get c4, queen's gambit, and now we get e6, knight to c3, and we get for the first time the introduction to the Tarrasch defense. Yes, Siegbert Tarrasch championed and created this defense. We went through some games of his earlier where he was playing on the white side with some wonderful successes. And here we get this moment of pawn takes d5, pawn takes d5, knight to f3. Let's talk about what black has achieved here. Black has used this queenside pawn to help attack the middle of the board. So they have now placed counter pressure on white's center in this one. As we've often seen, this pawn has been a bit of a problem and has been used to sort of protect on c6, or as we saw, it became a weakness and a gap later on. So black chooses to counter the center and immediately place pressure. Also, we can see that black has a little bit more freedom here to develop their light squared bishop than we've previously seen. Now let's talk about the negatives of what black has achieved. Number one, they now have this hanging pawn, which in future, as we'll see, will become an isolated pawn. This is a real potential problem that white will want to target. And we'll unpack again that theme of the isolated queen pawn position, IQP. And the idea is black would get space using this pawn, but white wants to focus to put pressure onto that pawn. So here we get knight f6. Immediately, white was looking at ideas of taking and pressuring through the middle. So we get pawn to g3. Now, this is a strange move compared to what we've seen, but actually very common in modern chess. Certainly at the time when Rubinstein was playing this way, it was much more common for white to simply develop their bishop with a pin or f4, then play e3, develop in a standard queen's gambit fashion. But here Rubinstein is already thinking very deeply about the future positions that will come about. His attention is focused on this pawn on d5. And he'd like to fianchetto the bishop to maximize his pressure on that pawn. So we can see he's already developing with a future intention. Very nice. Remember, when you're developing, try to develop with an intent, a plan, a mission. And that's what we're seeing in the structure. So we get knight to c6, bishop to g2. Pawn takes on d4, revealing the pressure situation here. So white takes back. Now we have that pawn structure, the isolated queen's pawn. Now, very important, where we see black has space, that is the only pawn in the middle, but black also now has a duty to protect that pawn because it's isolated. There are no other pawns that can assist it. So the pieces have to hold that. And that can in many ways be a problem for black because if the pieces are forced into holding onto that weakness, they become less, they become diminished. And that is the goal for white. So here we get this move, queen to b6. Black immediately tries to play as actively as possible to try and change the position, change the balance. So we get this move by Rubinstein, knight takes c6. Wait one moment, but now the opponent gets to take, and this pawn is no longer isolated. Why did he develop the bishop here? Well, Rubinstein's depth of thought is impressive. And this one I hope you can take forward in your games. When we look in this position at the pawn structure, there is only this weak pawn. That is all. Black is using this tactic with pressure, threatening to win a piece. When white captures, now suddenly two weaknesses appear. This pawn on a7 is isolated, and this one is going to become a backward pawn on a semi-open file. So two weaknesses. Very instructive. The positive for black, of course, is that their pawn protects their center pawn, and they potentially have a platform for attack. But the depth of thought here from Rubinstein is exceptionally smart, because now he's going to have a future plan of long-term pressure on the c-file. And remember to go back to the game of Grunfeld, the game of Noteboom, this idea of pressure onto this weak pawn and the ideas that we get with that. So now we get simply castles, very smart. The middle is beginning to open. Black develops with bishop e7, and let's head towards the middle game. Here, Rubinstein plays knight a4, wonderful move. The intention is to fix this pawn as backward. He does not want to give the chance for that pawn to go forward. I do want you to see that this is a hole. This is a weak square that black is struggling to control, since he has no pieces that can be used, no pawns that can protect that square, and he has to use pieces. So white's intention is to occupy that square. We know we should not put a knight on the side of the board without a clear plan of getting it back into the game. So he continues, queen b5, bishop e3. He develops again with intention. Look at the work. He fixes these pawns so they cannot move forward. There is no choice of them. Remember, we've picked up on the previous ones. Go back, have a look at some of the earlier videos. Fix your opponent's weak pawns. Fix the weaknesses so that you can target them. And when we say fix, we're talking about freezing them, stopping them from moving. Because if they can adjust, then potentially they could push us away. If black was given all the freedom in the world, they would love to be able to push, gain the space over here. But we can see that that is impossible. Why? Because, of course, sitting behind this is the bishop, creating all of this trouble. So very, very intelligent play now by White to focus on these weaknesses. And how does he continue? He wants this square. Right now, we can see that he cannot occupy that square because there is a contest over it. So he continues to push for that play. Look at the rook occupying the semi-open file. We can see now c5 is under white's control. c6 is now a weak square that they have to control. So black seizes the chance to get their bishop out. This was the intention of this kind of opening by black. Notice there's a lot more freedom to develop. It's a little bit more open than, for example, game 17 or 18 that we looked at, where the center was very closed. And here, the threat is this pawn. So Rubinstein decides he will play f3. I would prefer in modern times we would understand things a little bit better, where we would want to play a move like rook to e1, which in simple terms, we are using a piece to solve a problem. But his move of f3, as we'll see, has a clear intention in this case, where he simply now stops the threat. The opponent moves bishop back to e6, and now he wants to focus on these weak dark squares. So what does he do? A wonderful tool that we've seen earlier, that we've seen a bit before in the chess games. If you want to fight for specific weak squares, trade off the bishop that the opponent has to control those squares, because the bishop is the very best protector of these type of positions, and that's instructive for us to see. So he trades it off, not the only path, but he does occupy this weakness. So the rook moves to e8, Now he decides to play rook f2. This is, again, a forward-thinking maneuver that I do want you to remember. Very fine move. The intention is he would like to build up his play onto that c pawn. He would like to double rooks on that file. And this is the intended idea. e3 with the rook coming across. Very smart planning in this case. We would describe this position a little bit more quiet than a lot of the other games we've seen. There are no checks threatened from either side. There's no threats on each other's king. There are very few captures. We can see that white doesn't have extremely active pieces. When we say activity, pieces making a lot of threats. So now the knight goes back to d7. Bishop takes on e7. Black is doing a good job of trying to fight for the square. Now we see the queen taking back. We can now also take note that if we wanted to understand the intention by the opponent, Black is hoping in future to push their pawn. Black is hoping to get their knight into the game. So here we need to think carefully and think from White's perspective and say, okay, how does White solve this problem? Well, Queen d4. Very nice. Looking at both sides of the board. Brilliant square in the center of the board. Also, they prevent this advance of c5. Very, very smart. So Black is struggling for a plan because we can see that this queen is starting to pressure the pawn. The rook is starting to pressure this. And remember, when your opponent has a weakness, we would like to pressure that weakness to force them to defend. The pieces become less. I do want you to carefully see here how Black's rook now cannot join in the game, cannot just mobilize, because it is forced into protecting this pawn on a7. So we get a continuation, rook to e8, and then Rubinstein shows us another theme. Wonderful positional theme. Get every piece into the game. Try to find a job and a role for all pieces. So the rook is going to come across, and he would also like the bishop involved. So he plays bishop f1, undeveloping his bishop with the intention that he could move the pawn to e3, e4 with a discovered attack onto the queen. Very instructive. So Black now has to find somewhere where their queen is going to go. They decide they're going to play rook c8 with a future idea of maybe trying to push c5. White closes the door, plays e3. Such a simple move, but a very clever one, because now I want you to see how White is bringing all their pieces to bear onto the queen side. So the queen moves to b7. We get knight into c5, targeting their queen and removing his last piece protecting the dark squares here. Very instructive moment. The knight captures, rook captures back with the intention that he would like to double to target this. Again, spectacular play. Look at the occupation of these dark squares. Very instructive. And this is something he did way back in the opening. When he captured on c6, he had this vision for the pawn structure. And this is a wonderful theme for you to remember. Again, we want to occupy the weak squares in the position. And by occupying them, we stop the opponent from mobilizing these pawns. Very, very instructive. Also, I want you to pay careful consideration here. We would now define White as having a good bishop because it works freely with his own pawns. It can move easily and affect the queen side or the king side. Black's bishop is what we call a bad bishop because it is so restricted by those very pawns that it carries no real impact on any of the queen side. And we've seen that in the previous games. Play where the bad piece cannot get to. So that is the focus. So Black plays here rook to c7. White plays rook f to c2. Wonderful. Doubling and targeting this pawn. And when you're playing your games, a lot of the time, if we look like this, you might think to yourself, but I cannot win this weakness. I can keep attacking, but he will keep defending. The idea is not to win that weak pawn, but to force the opponent to defend that weakness, and then we strike somewhere else. So now we get an important moment. The opponent plays queen b6. Where is our somewhere else? Why did they play queen b6? What is the intention here in this case? And it's important to realize that one of the ideas that Black has is to play a5 now, to get their pawn rolling forward, start using that as a tool. So, of course, What does he do to prevent this? He plays this move b4, fixing the weakness. The pawn cannot move, but also potentially threatening to push b5. So in this case, black plays pawn to a6. Wonderful. We now have this wonderful new weakness. Look at the bishop's ability to target that pawn. This is very important. When you look at the bishop, you might think white's bishop is passive, but actually it has a wonderful long-term future that we're going to see. We're busy learning here, how do we use the good bishop in a long-term battle versus a bad bishop? And this theme, again and again, I wish for you to learn and pick up. Play where your opponent's bad piece cannot get to. Very instructive. a6 is in trouble. Okay, so in this case, the opponent plays, white plays rook a5, targeting this pawn on a6, also setting up a wonderful prospect, because if black trades off queens, take careful consideration. This pawn is in trouble, this pawn is in trouble, and there is so much difficulty in this position if they drop their bishop back trying to defend. What do you think white would do? What's the plan from white? Yes, b5. Look at this special situation. And this position demonstrates something exceptional to you, something that Rubinstein was so very good with. Rubinstein was famous for his rook and pawn endgame skills, and how often he would outplay many players in rook and pawn endgames. And one of the key concepts we can see from this position and others, rooks are terrible defenders. As I've described before, as a matter of fact, a rook is a putrid defender. Look how bad black's rook is sitting on a8, trying to hold on the pawn. Compare that to white's rook on a5, which is helping to win the pawn and has the freedom to move around the board. The same can be said of the c7 rook. Rooks do not want to defend. They want to create their own threats. So in this position, needless to say, he does not trade off queens. He says, no, after the rook moves to a5, I will play rook to b8. He counterattacks. Very instructive. He wants to say, you take here, be my guest, and I will grab this, and I will counterattack in this position. That is his goal, is to go after the pawn. Okay, so white says, no, I'm not trading weaknesses, and that's valuable for you. Don't go trade your opponent's weak pawn for your strong pawns. So here he follows with a simple plan, pawn to a3. Now let's see that difference. This pawn on a6 is isolated. It is weak on its own. No pawn can come save that pawn. This pawn on b4 is now protected by another and cannot be easily undermined. There are no pawn breaks available at this stage. Notice the fact that when we talk of a weak pawn, black's pieces have to go and defend that pawn. Whereas this pawn on b4, white is not concerned, white is fine. So what a wonderful positional theme. Black plays the move, rook to a7, trying to hold on. What are we going to do? Because now the idea is if we capture their queen, the rook would take back and they defend this square enough times. Also, they have this defense on c6. Or do they? Because now they have got themselves in this problem. We would technically call this a skewer, where the more valuable piece is skewered onto the less valuable piece. Think of it like the reverse of a pin. A pin, of course, is where the less valuable piece is pinned onto the more valuable piece. So here we use this wonderful chance. Because their pieces are in trouble, rook takes c6. A wonderful little mini tactic where the queen is overworked. And now the queen has to make a decision. I do want you to see something. Notice how early I identified that white's pieces were not very active. Now things have changed. This piece has a capture, this piece has a capture, the queen has multiple captures, the bishop has a capture. Notice black's pieces. Black's pieces, actually, besides the black queen, have no captures. That's how we measure activity. And also, I want you to remember that little tip in your games. Try to keep track of the different captures of each side to measure the activity. And when one side has a lot of activity and the other very little, there could be a chance that there's a tactic. And this is what we see in this game. What a wonderful idea. Rook takes c6. Now the queen captures back on c6. He doesn't want to trade queens. If you're down material, you would prefer to keep on some extra material to complicate things. So queen takes a7. Now they play rook a8. Okay, how should we conduct ourselves? We want a pawn. Wonderful. But unfortunately, when we're in a pawn, the chess game doesn't end. We still have a lot of work left to do. So let's talk about our approach. The first question you should ask yourself, if you win material, can you use your extra material to successfully attack the enemy king? What's extra? This pawn on b4. Well, we certainly cannot use that to attack the enemy king. Then the second question, can you trade down into a better endgame? Very important. Don't just blindly trade. Try and think, what endgame do you want? Well, we can look here and see the first endgame we would want, number one on our list, would be a king and pawns, no other pieces, because then our outside pawn, extra pawn, means the most. We would happily go and just make this pass pawn and win the game. Then we say, what would be the pieces we don't want on the board? Queens. Queens complicate things a lot here. We're up a pawn, so we gladly want to trade off a queen, and that's the intention here. Very, very, very strong. So here he plays queen c5. Now he does miss a little bit of a tactic where he could technically play rook takes on a6, setting up rook takes here, rook takes c8, and then the opponent would capture here. Now, but this is very clever from Rubinstein. I just want you to see this little mini tactic where now the queen and the rook threaten this square. So there is no real choice. The bishop has to defend this as well. So they would trade rook takes, and then rook takes on a3. This position is wonderful for white, but because of another little mini tactic. He missed, I think in his calculation, Rubinstein missed this idea of rook a6. Deleting rooks. We want the rooks gone. Why? Because now there is the setup of a back row checkmate, so the opponent has to trade. And this is why I was saying to you, ask yourself that question. What endgame do you want? If you want to trade, what pieces do you want off? Rubinstein said, I want the queens gone. I also want the rooks gone. That would be wonderful. That's part of the theme that he has. So in this case here, Rubinstein takes a step and he plays queen c5. Notice how you can use tactics to remove complications. But now we get an important moment. The opponent plays queen to b7. He does not want to trade. Okay? Our opponent is being difficult. So Rubinstein sets up king f2. Why? Why would we play king f2? Again, forward thinking by Rubinstein. So valuable. When you have control of the game, when you stand better and you're up material, try to think carefully always, what is the opponent's threat? What do they want to do? So often in a chess game, we are guilty of exuberance and overconfidence, where we think we have no threats to worry about. And instead, when you're up material, you should be focused on number one, how do I stop my opponent's counterplay? And this is the counterplay. They would like to play pawn to d4, followed by queen takes f3. Is it winning for them? Certainly not. But it does complicate the game because our king becomes weak. So instead, in this position, white simply plays king f2. Brilliant work from Rubinstein. Remember that. In your games, you're up material. One of the big questions to keep asking, what is my opponent would like to do? How can I take it away from them? Very instructive. That's what we call good technique in chess, doing what the position demands. So the opponent plays h5, as we've just discussed. Black is worse off, so they would like to complicate. And part of the big complications, they need to try and make white's king feel the heat, feel pressure, feel tactics. So he plays simply bishop e2. And now the opponent plays g6 because he's not quite ready to give up more material by pushing the pawn. Calm play from Rubinstein. Now he plays queen d6 as he would like to build up a little bit more. Queen to c8. And then rook c5. This was the whole idea. He improves his pieces. It wasn't, again, a case where when we look at this moment of queen c8, he doesn't just want to grab this pawn. He doesn't want to allow the complications. And he would win another pawn, but now suddenly the queen would get to the other side. This square is weak. These are complications that white does not want to have. White says, I don't want to allow the opponent to have counterplay. And this is very instructive from Rubinstein. Rubinstein understands chess is much easier to play if you are the one making threats, if you are the one creating pressure. So he continues to build in this position. h4, fixing the opponent's queen side, king side, so he never has to worry about pawn to h4 himself. Now a5. How would you respond? The opponent's played a5. They're offering you a pawn. You can win the pawn. No problem in this case. You could take with a rook, you could take with a pawn, or what else could we do in this case? How else would we handle this? What does Rubinstein focus on? Rubinstein says, no, I don't want to allow their queen to get to the other side unnecessarily, and he plays this move rook c7. Very instructive as he begins potential operations on the other side. Now the opponent's queen is so paralyzed. Why? Why has this happened that black's piece is so passive? Because they've been relegated to defending. Look how this bishop has sat here as a piece of stone, as if it is simply just a pawn in the pawn chain protecting d5. It has created no threats in this game. Notice the rook in the corner, relegated to protecting this pawn. Now finally it's trying to get some freedom by opening a line. And white closes the door. White plays b5. So very instructive for you to see again how he stops counterplay. He smoothly, clearly removes that counterplay. Now the winning plan is simple. We have ourselves a pass pawn, and we're going to keep that pawn rolling until black stops us. So black pushes a4. We push b6. That dangerous pass pawn is threatening to arrive. Notice the effect of this position. Once again, this poor bishop can observe the queen side, but can do no harm to it, no effect whatsoever, while this bishop continually has showed its effectiveness. Attacking a6, originally it was a pawn, now the rook cannot come here to provide a pin because the bishop is there. So simply rook a5, he's desperate to seek some form of activity. Where the rook is going to get in, we don't know. Pawn b7, wonderful tactical threat. The discovered check is now threatened here, where he will play check with a discovered attack on the queen, winning the queen. So needless to say, there is not much choice. Black decides to move their king to g7. And once again, tactically, they've lost material. He actually did resign. And now we can see why, because of course, rook takes f7 check and we simply win the queen. And I want you to see this is so smooth. It's only here at the end of the game, the first time white has focused on the threat on the king. Pure positional masterclass. What is it that Rubinstein did so well? Let's highlight the first issue was fixing those weak squares, that play on the dark squares, ensuring that the opponent's pawns, right from the get-go, he ensured that they stayed frozen. This backward pawn on a file, this pawn on the a file. Very important how c6 was so weak. He fixed the c6 weakness and then played on the c5 hole, that c5 gap. Then he maximized the pressure with his pieces. When he played queen d4, and he got all his pieces to come to the queen side because his opponent could not match the same. Then finally, once he won the pawn, he ensured that the opponent did not get counterplay. It was so instructive how he was hyper vigilant on ensuring the opponent was not going to get any complications, any targets against his king, and ensuring that the pieces did not get active. I do want you to see in this little moment where we whisk through, notice how not one of black's pieces crosses the fourth rank. He has been completely tied down, having to defend these pieces. That is so incredible that black's pieces for the second half of the game did not get across onto white's half of the board, all because they were tied down to defending their weaknesses. A spectacular theme. What is a weakness? It's a square that the pawns cannot control, that we can attack. So c6 is a weak pawn, but weak pawns go with weak squares. c5 is weak, is a hole. We occupied it. Then he occupied, look at this, we say a weak, dark squared color complex. And then he was unable to generate counterplay. He ensured continually pressure on these weaknesses. And then this wonderful demonstration of using the tactical themes. Rook takes c6. I do want you to see that there were these many tactics that he used to develop his position, grow his position. And it was all built on the lack of activity of the opponent's pieces. And it was a build-up play. As white's pieces got more and more active, creating more and more threats, look for those tactical chances. The opponent is going to be tied down. Also, don't forget that bad bishop, frozen in stone on e6, unable to do anything. Why? Because it was stuck defending the pawns, and it was stuck behind its own pawns. Very instructive victory. So as I've said, if you are interested in follow up with the PDF of this with the notes and part explanations, just to help you to develop your understanding that little bit further, join the mailing list below and I'll send it to you. Otherwise, let's continue our wonderful journey on these brilliant positional games.